Hi, everybody. Okay, so before I do today's reading, I wanted to quickly just go over some class guidelines with you guys. I completely forgot to do this in the beginning of our school year, and it came to my attention recently, and so I figured just to do it before the reading. And I actually put it in the email in writing for your parents to read through the guidelines. So basically, what I expect from you guys through the school year. So, number one is everyone needs to complete all their assignments that are given to them. Just whatever homework assignments I give you guys, just make sure you complete all of those assignments. Number two, and going back to that for a minute, I don't give out like a grade. What I basically do is, you're going to either pass my class or you're not going to pass my class. So, and my class, I think I did mention this at the beginning of the year. My class is basically an elective course, and you can use it for 1 credit for an elective. So basically, as long as you're doing the assignments I give you guys and you guys are, participating, that's another one of my guidelines, is just like class participation. You guys know how I've been doing it. I just randomly call on different people every week to share the narration that they put in their notebooks. I'm probably going to have you guys be starting to pull your notebooks out, and just so I can see that everybody put the narration in their notebook, and so I can just see that everybody's doing it. And, as long as you guys participate and you guys follow all these guidelines, everybody, will pass. I don't do any tests or anything like that. I just want to make sure you guys are at least putting an effort into doing the assignments and so forth. Okay, so the next thing is no cell phones during my class, which that hasn't been an issue. Unless, unless we're in a situation where we're learning about something and we're looking something up on our phones, which, could happen. And so in other words, unless permission is given. Obviously, if you get an emergency phone call or something like that, or, you can use your phone. You can look at your phone. There's always exceptions. And the last thing, I think, let me just looking at my notes here. Yeah. Okay, so I think the last thing is basically just being on time to class. So I just want to make sure everybody puts a good effort into being there on time. I know our class starts at 9 a.m. It's one of the earlier classes, but the only exception, there are, if you have a reason, like a valid excuse why you're not on time, that's fine. Like, for example, we were stuck in traffic, or you had to go to the bathroom or something. I mean, it happens. I've been there too, where I've been coming to co-op. I live 45 minutes away from co-op, so it's a bit of a drive for me. And there's been times that I've been a little late because I got stuck in traffic on the way or something like that. There was, different issues. So I get it. It happens. But for the most part, everybody needs to just be on time. And if you are late and you come in, I just would ask that you just kind of let me know why you're late. Again, as long as it's something that's not an excuse, a valid excuse, it's fine. If any of these guidelines are not followed, and I have an issue with where there's an issue going on, and it keeps happening, I'm gonna have to contact your parents and talk to them about it, and then we would go from there about a solution. So basically that's pretty much it, guys. I'm sorry I didn't do this earlier in the year. I should have laid down the guidelines right from the start, and I kind of just totally forgot to. So I wanted to make sure I did it now, when it came to my mind. So that's it. And like I said, I put this in an email to your parents. I wrote it out for them to read through the guidelines too, so everybody knows. And now for the reading. Okay. Part 4, Attila. On a summer night in the year of 408, a flaming red comet appeared over Europe, striking terror into the hearts of all who saw it. Menacing omen, a flaming red comet shaped like a tremendous eagle with a sword in its talons. In that year, when the walls of Rome were cracking before the onslaught of the Goths led by King Alaric, when the Vandals were invading Hispania led by King Gunderic, when Roman Britain was fighting a losing war against the terrible barbarian pirates, the Saxons. On a summer night of that year was Attila born. And on that night did pity, tenderness, and love die forever in the heart of Bendigas. The thousands who had heard his reckless challenge and had witnessed the dreadful punishment could and did shed tears of pity for him. The eyes of Bendigas were dry, his face a cold mask, for the heart within him had turned to stone. He did not see the hand of Hunar held to him with pity and love. He did not feel the restraining hand of Deimos as he had made his way once more to the now cold and dark altar. He did not see that even the most reckless and ruthless of his men covered their eyes and fell to their knees when he again mounted the steps and lifted his face to the sky when he uttered these words, Hadur, powerful God, thou hast indeed turned the sword against me. Thy sword, Hadur, not mine, but thou hast given me a scourge in its place, and I swear to thee, I, Bendigas, the white eagle, that I shall use that scourge, that I shall make it into the most dreadful weapon ever known to men. Thou hast given me a son, Hadar. He will be that scourge, my son, Attila, the red eagle, the scourge of God. And at that hour, Flavius Haronius, the Roman emperor, gazed out of the window of his palace in Milan long and fearfully at the flaming red comet. He knew that the great structure of the Roman Empire was trembling and cracking under his feet. But this fearful omen heralded the end. From afar came the sound of tolling church bells. From below came the sound of people praying in the streets and the droning voice of a friar. Woe unto you, for ye build the sepulchres of the prophets, and your fathers killed them, that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation. Verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation. And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of all nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming to the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. At that hour, Christians and pagans all over Europe prayed that this dreadful thing approaching from the east might be averted for them. And in the dark tent between the river Ra and the river Taunus, a newborn child cried bitterly, cried for comfort and warmth and tender love, cried for the things he was never to know. Early in the fall of that year, in the month of the Romans called September, the great army of the Huns stood ready. It was night. Thick white mist hung close to the ground, but above countless stars glittered in the dark blue sky. The full white moon looked down on what seemed to be the reflection of countless stars on the ocean of white mist, glittering tips of helmets, spears, and javelins, phalanx upon phalanx of them. The great army of the Huns was waiting, listening to the last words of old Magyar, whom they were leaving forever. For the Magyars refused to go on any farther, refused to follow Bendigas, whose face was stone, whose eyes were ice, and whose voice was like the lash of a whip. The stars and the moon were listening too, and the moon summoned a wisp of cloud to hide its face behind it. The glistening drops of water on the hard faces of warriors might have been drops of rain from that cloud, might have been the tears of the moon, might have been their own tears, who knows? When the moon looked again, the sparkling helmets and spears were hidden in the rising mist. All the moon could see was the flag of the red eagle floating in the wind, moving slowly westward. Slowly, very slowly, for the whole of Europe rose up in arms against that flag. More and more armies gathered to check, to stave off the implacable doom that poured out of Scythia. The fertile prairies, the plowed fields, the green pastures of Samatia became a battleground where fresh field of glittering spears grew for each that death had mowed down, where brooks and rivers ran red with blood. Cimmerians, Dacians, Goths, Franks, Romans rallied in desperate effort to stop the Huns in vain. Month after month, year after year, the Huns passed forward, gaining 2 victories for each minor defeat. They are not human, spread the rumor in the camps of the opposing armies. Survivors of battles and escaped prisoners whispered strange tales, tales which struck terror into the hearts of listeners, tales about the man Bendigas who knew no pity and would tolerate none, Bendigas whose face was stone, whose eyes were ice, and who would ride into the most frightful slaughters, always without a sword, without army, carrying a small child on his shoulders. Later, there were tales about Attila the child, whose narrow, slanting, amber-colored eyes were like the eyes of an eagle, who always in the van, riding a coal-black horse, laughed at death, for the death was powerless against him. Attila, whose shrill voice rang out above the tumult of thousands like the scream of an eagle. The Huns call him the Red Eagle, ran the rumor far and wide, and his fathers call him Attila, the Scourge of God. The Scourge of God, echoed the cry from land to land. Flagellum Dei, whispered Pope Incentus, and sent his priests into far countries to preach Christianity with renewed zeal, to remind people of the words of the angry Lord. The lion is come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. He is gone forth from his place to make thy land desolate, and thy city shall be laid waste without an inhabitant. For this grid you will with sackcloth. Sorry guys, got a little mixed up. For this grid you with sackcloth lament and howl, for the fierce anger of the Lord is not turned back from us. And indeed, it seemed as if the Huns were superhuman. Joint armies of many nations became panic-stricken, rabble, wrecked, scattered, trodden down to the dirt by this merciless avalanche of horsemen. The Huns themselves were like possessed fanatics, in whose souls the vision of the promised land burned with such a blinding white flame that they could not even see the perils on their path. Their eyes were on Attila, Attila the fearless, Attila the invulnerable. Take a sip, hold on. They feared Bendigas, but they worshipped his child. To them, he was a symbol, a promise fulfilled by Hadar. He was their great red eagle. And the child, Attila, who from the moment of his tragic birth had been deprived of love, tenderness, and comfort, grew hard as steel in the body and soul. He had learned not to cry when he was but a few days old. Crying did not help. Crying only brought a voice colder than the winds chilling his small body, sharper than the pangs of hunger. The only lullabies he had ever known were rousing war songs, battle cries, and the whine of flying arrows. His only toys were sharp weapons, and he soon learned not to cut himself. For if he did and whimpered with pain, those icy eyes would freeze the whimpers in his throat. He was hardly old enough to walk when he was strapped into the saddle and made to ride at the side of his father for long, weary hours. He had learned to handle bow and arrow before his speech. He had lost his childish lisp. His young muscles stretched, grew taut and strong, and if they sometimes ached almost unbearably, no one ever knew it. The first words he learned were the 1,000 times repeated words of Bendigo's. Fear is sin. Weakness is sin. These words became his credo, a hard core around which he built his life. Only after he had learned never to expect help or sympathy from anyone did Bendigo's allow him to mingle with the men. Only then, listening to the tales and songs of the warriors, did he learn of the past of his people and of the future they believed in. And when he heard the story of the tragic night when he was born, a strange new feeling flooded his heart, love and compassion for the silent, cold man who was his father. And great determination surged up in him to find that land, to find that sword of Hadur, to make the world kneel to its power. From then on, the child was a man, the red eagle who laughed at death. Death could not touch him. He had a promise to fulfill. He was 15 years old. No one knew what had changed boy into man almost overnight, least of all Bendigo's. He only saw that Attila was taking more and more of the burdens of leadership on his own shoulders, that he held the tremendous army in a grip far stronger than his own had ever been. The way of the serpent was not the Huns' way. They hated planned campaigns, find retreats, stealthy midnight attacks. Now, for Attila, they learned them all and scored more victories than ever before. They still loved the times best when Huns' trumpets blared forth an open challenge to the enemy, and Attila, clad in scarlet from head to toe, mounted on his coal-black steed, awesome like the god of war, led them into a whirlwind attack. Then indeed did they turn into demons, tearing through the enemy's iron ranks as wind tears through a film of rain. Demons roaring with laughter as the enemy scattered, scampering for the shelter of shrub and woods. A blood-speckled, dust-covered herd trying to escape the doom of trampling hoofs and swinging swords. At night, after these thundering attacks, they flaunted their wounds, made light of their losses, and roared their exultation into triumphant songs. One night, after one of these sweeping victories, old Bendigo's went to the tent of his son. Attila was asleep, his great body relaxed, a thin smile of triumph still lingering around his lips. Bendigo stood for a long time looking down at him with a growing feeling of awe, such as he had not known before. And then, for the night was cold, he removed his own cloak, laid it gently on his sleeping son. Attila stirred, and Bendigo's left the tent quietly, puzzled at his own tender gesture. He walked slowly to a nearby hill and up its gentle slope. The sleeping camp spread out below him, and stars above trembled in the sky. He was alone in the misty night, seemingly in the center of the immense circle formed by starlight earth and star-spangled sky. Heaven and earth were silent, breathlessly expectantly silent. And old Bendigo's, alone on the hill, alone with his God, sank slowly to his knees. Hadur, he sighed, mighty Hadur, I have kept my promise. I have made my son into the most dreadful weapon ever known to men. And now I am frightened at my own handiwork. 20 years, he cried, his voice suddenly loud. 20 years of war and millions of dead behind him. Was it thy will, Hadur? Will he ever wash himself clean of blood with the waters of the promised land? The cold stars trembled and the earth remained silent, but far above, from beyond the stars, came a voice, and at the sound of it, the crust of ice suddenly melted from the heart of old Bendigo's. A voice sweet, soft, and so low that his ears did not hear it. He heard it with his heart. Lead me westward, white eagle of the moon. Oh, lead me on silvery rays of the moon. Westward I long to fly. Westward, always westward. The wild mountains of Altan Allah were but a legend to the Huns. The years by the misty blue lake only a fading memory. The past lived in songs, the present in the flashing swords, and the future in their hearts. The future was a land between two great rivers surrounded by mountains. But they did not know what mountains were. Since the tribe had left the blue lake, their path had led through deserts, plains, and prairies, flat or gently rolling land where their eagle eyes could sweep the blue horizon, where they could see the ponderous ironclad armies of the enemy advancing slowly, where they always had the advantage over them, mounted as they were on swift prairie-bred horses. And then, after half a century of warfare, when Attila was 25 years old, it seemed as if the last great armies of Europe were exhausted. During the summer and fall of that year, the Huns found less and less opposition. They were in eastern Dacia by late winter, having crossed the rivers Dniester and Prut at their lowest ebb. Westward, thundering westward now like a wave lifting its crest, warriors more than grains of sand or blades of grass on the plains. Under the hooves of their horse, the snow-covered frozen ground groaned, and the icy air echoed with their shouts, "Westward with Attila." Like a wave lifting its crest to hurl against a rock and fall back, its great power shattered into myriads of sparkling atoms. Like a wave rushing on blindly, did they hurl themselves against a barrier, the great impassable sheer walls of the Carpathian Mountains. Before them stretched the mountains in a tremendous arc, cliff upon cliff, peak upon peak, icy, formidable, without a visible break anywhere, and behind them, closing in slowly, confidently, like the jaws of a steel trap sure of its prey, came the enemy. Day after day, Attila sent out scouts to find a pass across the mountains. The men went without a murmur into the icy wilderness, too strange to them, where wolves howled and treacherous chasms waited for the underwary, and those who returned at all returned with these words, "There is no way across." And listening to the deep rumble of the ground, watching the ring of campfires across the white plains, drawing closer and closer every night, Attila knew that there was no way back. The steel trap fashioned with cunning and hate, and the lust for revenge was closing in on them. It was more inexorable than the icy walls of the mountains. For days, the weather had been growing steadily colder. The sun was hiding behind the laden clouds, heavy with snow. The Huns had no more wood for fires. The rocky cliffs around them were barren of trees. People huddled close together for a little warmth, silent, miserable, puzzled. In the gray dusk of the seventh day, Bendigoz and Attila were sitting alone in an icy tent. There was no need for words. There were no words to express what they felt. The impending doom of their people and their own helplessness tore at them with claws more vicious than the claws of the numbing cold. There was no hope in the heart of Attila. To him, the future seemed darker than the thickening night. Bendigoz was watching his son's face with a growing sense of apprehension. Those slanting amber-colored eagle eyes were mere slits now, slits through which he could see despair change into defiance, and defiance into blazing fury. The sinew hands of Attila were working, opening, and clenching into terrible fists. and suddenly he was on his feet, his head thrown back. On his face, a wretched semblance of a smile, and his voice, a tragic parody of laughter. The Red Eagle, look at me now, oh. Attila, snapped the voice of Bendigus like the lash of a whip, and his old eyes blazed again with a icy flame. Attila, kill the snake of doubt in your soul. Crush the worms of fear in your heart, and mountains will move out of your way, and your foes will become less than a handful of dust before your sword. Attila, pray, but do not challenge. Be strong, my son. Trust yourself and the God in your heart. The tortured face of Attila relaxed. He laid his arm around the shoulder of Bendigus. Forgive me, Father, he whispered. Your faith is greater than mine. Yes, my son, sighed Bendigus. His voice was heavy with memories. It is now. His steady gaze held the eyes of his son, and a great understanding silence fell upon them both. Outside, snow hissed against the tent, and the wind moaned mournfully. Attila lifted his head. Listen, Father, listen to that wind. No, he cried. It's not the wind. People are calling my name. Listen. Attila, Attila, came the cry of many voices. Attila. He tore the tent flap open, and the wind smote him with violence. Dark, sharp shapes of men were tumbling through the tearing flood of snow. Attila, gasped the first to reach him. Look. For a moment, he could see only the mad swirl of snowflakes. Then he saw, luminously white against the white of the snow, standing still like a majestic statue, glowing with an unearthly light, the white stag. Attila whipped around and swept a bugle from the tent. To saddle, blared the bugle above the howls of the gale, and others took up the call in the distance. Follow the stag, cried Attila, leaping into the saddle. Follow the stag, echoed the mountains. Follow the stag, howled the wind. The white stag moved ahead of them, now slowly, now swiftly, like a shimmering will-o'-the-wisp, always just within sight, but never letting them nearer, leading them safely over treacherous icy expanses, across deep drifts of snow. Attila and Bendigus were in the van behind them, the tremendous cavalcade breaking a path wide and safe for the packing horses and wagons to follow. No one knew whither the miraculous stag was leading them. The white stag of Hun legends, the stag of Hunar and Magyar. Perhaps it was their own faith they were following now as always. Faith in the guiding hand of Hadur, the powerful god. Faith smoothed their path under the stumbling feet of their horses. Faith gave them strength to ride through the buffeting wind and whirlpools of stinging snow into the unknown. Gradually the storm abated. Ahead of them was still night, but in the east the sky grew gray with waking light. And then they saw that stag had led them into a winding defile between towering peaks, a deep secret gorge eaten through the rocks by a rivet. To the left and right were the overhanging cliffs leaning over the gorge, curiously like giants leaning down to watch a procession of ants. A faint green light hovered above the cliffs. Then the pale golden rays of the rising sun poured into the gorge. The pass widened, rocks and cliffs drew back and gave way to a gentle wooded slope. The white stag was hardly visible now. In the golden daylight, it seemed to have lost all substance and became light against light. Attila and Bendigus reined in their horses and watched that shining radiance until it was no more. Then they drew aside, waiting for those behind them to pass. For hours the immense cavalcade poured forth from the gorge, flooding the sunlight westerly slopes of the mountains, winding like a giant dragon amid trees and shrub. The slopes were a billowing sea of spears, and the excited voices of the multitude pulsed like a rushing of waves. The sun reached its noonday height when the last heavy wagons arrived. After them, the carnivorous mouth of the gorge gaped empty. The Huns were across the barrier. And on the other side of the Carpathians, the blizzard raged for days. The east wind swept snow against the mountains like a gigantic broom, sweeping deep valleys in the snow on the ground, forming new ridges of drifts, covering the broken path of the Huns and hiding, perhaps forever, the secret entrance to the pass. "What enchanted land is this?" asked Attila of each golden dawn and every scarlet sunset as they advanced toward the west. The slim legs of his black steed fairly danced as he rode swiftly through the forest and field, his eyes scanning the ever-changing beauty of the land like that of which he had never seen before. "What enchanted land is this?" wondered old Bendigo's riding beside his son. "A land like an immense green bowl surrounded by mountains, warmed by the sun, sheltered from the cold. Behind them rolled the great army, their weapons and helmets glittering in the sunlight, in the moonlight. What enchanted land is this?" they thought as they rode through the forest rich in game, across rivers alive with fish. Spring had met them on the way and flung a glorious carpet of flowers under their feet, as if spring were welcoming long-awaited friends. Winter and hostile armies were locked out by those gray rocky walls which had so miraculously opened to let them through. The few small tribes who inhabited this land showed no ill will. Sorry, I lost my place. What enchanted land is this where new riches, new beauty spread out before them every hour, riches and beauty cupped together under a laughing blue sky, where the joy of life and peace trembled in each opening bud, where the song of whispering breeze and gurgling brooks had the magic power to banish memories of bloodshed. Only 7 days had passed since they had crossed the Carpathians, and the despair of that stormy night seemed 7 lifetimes away. A land rich in game and green pastures, between 2 great rivers, rich in fish, surrounded by mountains, the legendary words of Nimrod chimed like bells of hope in the heart of Attila, when, after crossing the river Pathesis, his swift-riding scouts returned and told him that within a day's journey to the west, there was another wide river, the Dambius. He decided to let his people rest for a while. After that day, men and women worked joyously, happily, putting up tents, preparing for a great spring festival, a festival of thanksgiving to Hadur. They built an altar, the first altar to Hadur since they had left the Magyars. It was ready by sundown, a great altar carefully built. It stood like a monument of faith on the crest of a solitary hill above the rolling green plains. Sorry, guys, I'm just looking to see how much more. We're almost done. This is the end, so it's a little longer. Night fell, softly spreading its wings of silence over the sleeping camp. Century fires glowed for a while, then closed their eyes, and only the stars, vigilant sentinels of the night, kept watch over the earth. They watched as the ghost hour crept in among the tents, trailing its mantle of dreams. They watched when, in the deep silence of the ghost hour, a lone man, a tall, majestic figure wrapped in a white cloak, walked slowly to the altar. The stars caught a glimpse of a scarlet under the white cloak, and they knew who the man was. They watched as the man before whose sword a continent trembled sank to his knees and touched his forehead to the cold stones. They listened and heard his prayers, but the stars kept their silence, for it was not for them to answer. Between the stars and the man, shadows passed on silent white wings, white herons returning from the south now that the long winter was over. They passed silently, and when at last the man arose and lifted his eyes to the sky, the herons were gone. He only saw a single wispy white feather as it came drifting down, its edges pure silver in the starlight. It touched his upturned face and came to rest over his heart. And then he knew that his prayers had been heard and would be granted. Before dawn began to gather for the festival, they came afoot and on horseback from all directions, for the tribe was so numerous now that the forest of their tents stretched farther than your eyes could see. Men, women, and children came bringing gifts to Hadar, single spring blossoms clutched in the tiny fists of babies, battle-worn shields, jeweled swords, and helmets, treasured possessions of old warriors. They came and laid their gifts around the altar. They joined the ever-growing crowd before the hill. Old Bendigas came, lighted the fire on the altar, and stood waiting, his face turned towards the east, where Attila's tent glowed like a red flower on the green grass. The dark sky behind the distant blue mountains grew luminous with the promise of sunrise. A murmur of admiration rose from the waiting crowd, for just as at the first flaming arrow of the new day shot upward from the rising sun, they saw Attila riding toward them, red and gold against the glowing sky. His shining helmet caught in the light behind him, and it seemed as if he were wearing a golden crown. His amber-colored eyes looked straight ahead, and the light in them matched the light of the sun. There was no one among his people so silently watching his approach who would not have died 1,000 deaths for him. Their red eagle, greatest of all leaders, he was more than a leader. He was their king, and he looked a god with the golden crown of the rising sun around his head. A small girl tore her hand from her mother's fingers and ran toward Attila. Toward all his shining glory with outstretched arms, she ran, her little laughing face upturned, her small bare feet twinkling in the smooth grass. Attila dismounted and waited, smiling back at her. When the child stumbled and fell, she cried out and held up a bleeding hand to him, and Attila, whose sword had dealt death to thousands, bent down to comfort this child. Then, while he kneeled beside her, the sharp glint of metal caught his eyes, a curious fiery glint. He reached for it, and his fingers closed on the hilt of a sword. Deeply embedded into the soil, it gave the pull of his mighty arm, and he looked at it with the growing sense of awe. It was a Hun sword, straight and slim, and on the smooth surface of its blade was the chaste image of a flying eagle. His face grew pale. Holding the sword on the palms of his hand, he walked slowly up to the altar, blind to the crowd thronging around him, his eyes never leaving the face of his father. He saw that face grow as white as his own. He saw the strong lips tremble, and he heard the hoarse, choked whisper, "The sword of Hadar." The words echoed from the lips of thousands, "The sword of Hadar." Slowly he turned and laid one arm around the bent old soldiers of Bendigas. In his right hand he held the sword and lifted it high above his head. Pointing straight to the morning sky, his eagle eyes gazed unflinchingly into the sun, and his voice rose triumphant like a bugle call of victory. "Upon this altar of Hadar, our powerful God, with his sword in my hand, I swear to Hadar above, to the sun in the east, to the moon in the west, I swear to the stars in the north and the stars in the south, to protect and hold this land against all powers on earth for my people." Then he mounted to the highest step of the altar and slashed the air with his sword, to east, to west, to north, to south, and stood again facing the sun, the rising flames of the fire behind him like great flaming wings, the sword in his upraised arm pointing to the sky. He stood, king of the promised land, Attila the Conqueror. Okay, guys, and that is the end of The White Stag. So I hope you enjoyed this book, and do your narrations in your notebooks. I will be checking those and calling on someone to share with us so we can discuss. And I will share with you guys in our next class the next book we are going to be reading. So God bless. I hope you guys have a great week. See you Tuesday.